In this mini video, we're going to introduce Vue components, which are like reusable Vue instances that come with their own templates, data, and methods. What's really cool is that we can make use of custom HTML elements that encapsulate them. For example, a blog might have a number of posts, each post having the same template and functionalities, such as a like button. So it might make sense to define a blog post component to encapsulate all of these common features. Here we have one such instance of a blog post. We're passing a particular title to it, and after interpolating the mustache syntax given in the components template, we render a simple header in the DOM. As always, this is best shown by example, so let's return to our running theme of famous Brits. This time, instead of rendering a list or table of Brits, I want to render an interactive information box for each of them, encapsulating the necessary template, data, and methods using a custom component. First, let's remind ourselves of the API endpoint, getBrits.php. Once again, it returns a list of Brits containing information about their names, vocations, but this time also relative paths to pictures of them. First things first, let's set up the main Vue instance. As in the previous video, I'm going to define a function for it to call immediately after it mounts the DOM, and that function will use the Axios library to send a GET request to the API and retrieve that array of Brits. Recall that I have to provide first the URL of the API, then a function for handling the response, and then finally a function for handling an error. For the error case, I'm just going to display an alert with the information from Axios. In the successful case, I'm going to store the object converted from the JSON into a property called BritArray. And then I'm going to use the mustache syntax to make sure everything is working correctly. Since I only want the array from this object, I'm going to use the Britons property to extract it. Okay, now that we've got the data, I want to define a reusable component for the interactive information box we're going to be using to render each Brit. I'm going to call that component BritCard. I'm using a hyphen in the name here, which is recommended practice to avoid clashing with any future HTML elements. To register this component in Vue, I need to use Vue.component, passing the name as well as an object for customizing it. I'm going to keep it simple initially and give it a template that simply displays test. If I have multiple instances of our new BritCard component, you'll see multiple instances of test. Now, a component isn't very useful if its template is fixed. We want to be able to pass in custom information. In Vue, this is done via custom attributes called props. After listing the props that our component accepts, we can render them in the template using mustache syntax. When I provide different values to the props of these Brit cards, you see different values rendered on the screen. Same component, but instantiated differently, a bit like the idea behind classes and objects. When I try to render the vocation in an element after the header, you'll see that Vue gives us an error. Take note of this. A component template must have a root element, whereas here we have two elements that are siblings. We can fix this by wrapping them both inside a new div. Okay, before I do anything else, I'm going to adapt the templates a little bit to make use of Bootstrap's responsive grid system. I want 2 of these components per row on devices with a screen width above the medium breakpoint, and 3 of these components per row on devices with a screen width above the large breakpoint. I'm also going to make sure that there's a bit of margin on the bottom of each of them. Lovely. At this point, I'm going to go into the Bootstrap documentation and adapt some of their sample code for the card component. Let me clean up this code a bit. We don't need a button, and we should render the Brit's name and vocation. Normally you should provide some alt text for accessibility reasons, but to minimize the number of bindings, I will remove it just for this example. Finally, we need to add a prop for the image location, which I'm going to give the name portrait. As I want to use portrait inside an attribute, I must bind it using vbind, or the shorthand for vbind. Lovely! Now, instead of manually passing in values of props, let's get them from the Brit array that we requested at the beginning of the video. Just like any other HTML element, we can use the v4 directive here to iteratively generate a sequence. I'm going to iterate over Brit array and extract the relevant values from each object. Again, as I'm evaluating these expressions in attributes, I need to make use of the vbind directive. Super! Now I can get rid of this hard-coded villain. Just a little more tinkering. I'm going to reduce the widths of the cards, then use the Bootstrap class mxauto to center them in their boxes. Finally, I'd like to make the Brit card component interactive by allowing users to identify their favorites. To achieve this, I'm going to associate each Brit card with some internal data, a Boolean property called isFav. Now please take note. In a normal Vue instance, data is provided directly as an object, but in a component, it is instead a function that returns a data object. The reason for this is technical. It ensures that each instance of Brit card can maintain its own independent data object. Inside the template, I'm going to use the conditional rendering directives to show an icon reflecting whether a given Brit is a favorite or not. I'm going to use an unfilled star symbol if it's not a favorite, and a super bright star emoji if it is. In both cases, I'm going to search for their HTML entity codes and insert them into the template. Now, when I open the console, I see an unexpected error. I forgot a closing tag, so let's add that. With that fixed, if I open the Vue DevTools and look at the component for Alan Turing, you'll see that toggling the value of isFav will reactively update the star icon, so everything's working. What's more, it doesn't affect the star icons of any of the other Brits who maintain their own data. Next, I'm going to add a method to the component called toggleFav, which simply negates the value of isFav from true to false or false to true. I'm then going to use this method as the event handler for click events on the two possible star icons. Okay, that seems to work, but it looks a little weird using the standard cursor, so let me change that using inline styling. Hopefully we're all done at this point, so let me test it out by favoriting a few ones at random. This chap though, I have to favourite, he's from my hometown. And that's it for this mini video. We covered components, which are named reusable Vue instances that have their own templates, data, and methods. We showed how to instantiate them using custom HTML elements that have their names. We pass data to components via props, or in other words, these custom attributes. We iteratively instantiated several components using the v4 directive of Vue. And finally, we showed how you can add data and methods properties to your components in order to make them more interactive, noting that the data object must be returned by a function. See you next time!